August 8, 1944. Normandy. A battlefield smouldered beneath the haze of cordite and burning fuel, the air trembling with the thunder of armoured giants. In the command cupola of Tiger 007, Hauptsturmführer Michael Wittmann adjusted his Zeiss binoculars, with hands that should have been steady, yet betrayed a faint tremor. Below him the ground was littered with blackened wrecks, 27 Sherman tanks reduced to twisted metal husks. His Tiger and the 3 others of his company had carved through them like a blade, their 88mm cannons exacting a kill with every shot. The numbers spoke of brilliance, nearly 7 Allied tanks destroyed for every Tiger lost. By the old mathematics of war, the Germans were winning. But Wittmann's gut told him another truth, one that clawed at the edges of his mind. For every Sherman destroyed, more appeared, rising from the dust like an endless tide. He counted them now, 48 fresh tanks advancing from 3 directions, and behind them more columns raising plumes of dust that seemed to stretch to the horizon. Inside his armoured beast, the smell of sweat and oil mingled with cordite. His loader's hands were raw from shoving shell after shell into the breach. The ammunition racks were nearly empty. Perhaps a dozen armour-piercing rounds remained across all 4 Tigers. Fuel was low, reinforcements were non-existent. Wittmann muttered into the radio, his voice brittle with fatigue, "Munition erschöpft, Gegner unbegrenzt." Ammunition exhausted, enemy unlimited. His words, logged at 12:47 hours, would become the epitaph not only of his crew, but of Germany's armoured dream itself. Moments later, Tiger 007 erupted in flames under the impact of a British Firefly or Canadian gun. Historians still argue over who fired the fatal shot. Wittmann and his crew were annihilated instantly. This was not simply the death of one man or one tank, it was as the death of a philosophy, Hitler's fatal obsession with engineering masterpieces that could dominate any battlefield duel. For in that same hour, far away, factories in Detroit, Grand Blanc and Pittsburgh were rolling Shermans off assembly lines in numbers that dwarfed anything German intelligence had believed possible. Germany would build 1,347 Tigers across the entire war, each a marvel of engineering. America would roll out 49,234 Shermans, built so quickly and in such staggering numbers that even the destruction of dozens in a single day meant nothing. The war was no longer about tactical brilliance or the skill of tank aces. It had become a war of arithmetic, where the cold logic of mass production would decide the fate of empires. The legend of the Tiger tank was born from fear. Allied crews whispered its name in hushed tones, their voices taut with dread. The first reports in 1942 spoke of a beast that seemed invincible, its frontal armour immune to standard Allied guns, its 88mm KWK-36 cannon capable of killing from over 2 kilometers away. In Tunisia, in the fields around Sidi Bouzid, American Sherman crews saw their shells bounce like pebbles off a steel fortress. They were trapped in machines designed for speed and mobility, facing predators designed only for killing. Survivors later described the moment of contact as a slaughter, not a battle. But what history textbooks often omit is the hidden truth behind those early encounters. For every Tiger that roared onto the battlefield, entire convoys of trucks and fuel tankers followed. The machine was an apex predator, but one chained to its supply lines. Each Tiger consumed nearly 4 gallons of fuel for every mile it advanced. Its transmissions cracked under strain, and its 57-ton frame bogged down in soft mud. German diaries reveal how often Tigers were abandoned, destroyed not by enemy fire, but by their own weight. In January 1943, during the retreat from Leningrad, entire companies were scuttled by their crews, engines burning as Soviet infantry approached. The Tiger's reputation was forged not by its endurance, but by its rarity. A phantom weapon that struck terror precisely because it was seen so infrequently. Across the Channel, Allied commanders wrestled with the psychological impact. British intelligence circulated manuals titled Tiger Phobia, instructing crews that not every tank they faced was a tiger, despite the growing myth that every muzzle flash came from one. In reality, tigers made up less than 7% of Germany's armoured strength. The vast majority of battles were fought by Panzer IVs, far more vulnerable machines. Yet the Allies could not shake the spectre. Stories spread of single tigers halting entire offensives. At Villers-Bocage, Wittmann's rampage through British columns cemented the myth, and myths are often more dangerous than the weapons themselves. Meanwhile, in Detroit's River Rouge plant, another myth was being manufactured, not of invincibility, but of inevitability. Shermans were not designed to be the strongest or the deadliest. They were designed to be enough. Their 75mm guns could penetrate the sides of a panzer, their mobility allowed them to outflank, and most of all, they could be replaced. Where the Tiger was a duelist, the Sherman was an army. For every German crewman who prayed his Tiger would survive long enough for reinforcements, 10 Sherman crews boarded fresh tanks rolling off the docks of Cherbourg and Le Havre. The war was shifting. It was no longer about who had the better weapon. It was about who could afford to lose. Imagine standing on the muddy fields of Kursk in July 1943, the largest tank battle in history. The horizon was alive with fire, smoke, and the metallic shrieks of armour grinding against armour. German High Command had staked everything on Operation Citadel, believing that the shock of their new Tigers and Panthers would slice through Soviet defences like a scythe. Nearly 3,000 German tanks hurled themselves into the Soviet lines. But waiting for them was something Hitler had refused to believe possible. A Soviet wall of steel, over 5,000 T-34s, dug into layered defences, stretching for hundreds of kilometres. The Tiger entered the battle like a god of war. At ranges of 1,500 metres, its 88mm shells punched through T-34s with ease, turning steel into shrapnel and men into shadows. One Tiger ace, Otto Carius, later wrote of destroying 17 Soviet tanks in a single day. But even he admitted the truth. For every one I destroyed, 10 more appeared. The Soviets had mastered something the Germans could not replicate: sacrifice as strategy. Soviet commanders were willing to throw entire brigades of tanks into the maw of German fire, knowing that losses could be replaced within weeks. German officers marvelled, horrified at the relentlessness. Diaries described the battlefield as a sea of metal corpses, yet still the Soviet waves kept coming. And then came the cruelest irony. The Tigers, for all their engineering brilliance, began to falter. Their engines overheated in the summer dust. Their transmissions jammed. When a Tiger broke down, recovery was nearly impossible, too heavy to tow, too precious to abandon. Crews were ordered to blow up their own machines rather than let the Soviets capture them. In those moments, the myth of invincibility cracked. At Kursk, the Germans lost nearly 200,000 men and thousands of tanks. The Soviet tide had not only held, it had turned. The Tiger had roared, but the roar had been drowned by numbers. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, a different war machine was humming. In American factories, workers laboured day and night, their efforts untouched by bombing raids or shortages. By the time Kursk ended, the US had already built more Shermans than Germany would ever produce, of all tank models combined. In the math of war, every destroyed Sherman was an inconvenience. Every destroyed Tiger was a catastrophe. Kursk made it clear: the war would not be decided by the might of a single weapon, but by the grinding arithmetic of industry. The Tiger could win duels. The Sherman could win wars. By 1944, the Allies had stormed into Normandy, and the Tiger tank had become more than a weapon. It was a psychological ghost haunting every hedgerow. Sherman crews advancing through the bocage spoke of the eerie silence that fell before a Tiger strike. A single shot, a plume of fire, and a Sherman would vanish in seconds. Survivors remembered the smell of burning gasoline, the screams trapped inside steel coffins, and the helpless knowledge that their own guns could not pierce the Tiger's frontal armour. In after-action reports, US officers described the battlefield as a chessboard where one piece dominated all others. But in truth, the chessboard itself was shifting. For while the Tiger struck fear, it also betrayed its weakness. It took hours to refuel, required constant mechanical attention, and often could not even fit across narrow French roads. Shermans, by contrast, could drive all day, ford rivers, and be repaired with spare parts scavenged from wrecks. A Tiger disabled was a Tiger lost. A Sherman disabled was a Sherman reborn, often back in battle within hours. Allied engineers joked grimly, Shermans die standing, Tigers die sitting. The Allies adapted, not by matching the Tiger blow for blow, but by rewriting the rules of engagement. Specialized variants appeared. The British Sherman Firefly, its 17-pounder gun capable of piercing even a Tiger's front from the right angle. Crews painted camouflage on the barrels to disguise them, knowing the Tiger commanders would target Fireflies first. American units coordinated artillery, infantry, and airstrikes to smother Tiger positions before armor even engaged. When P-47 Thunderbolts screamed overhead, Tiger crews abandoned their machines in panic. The aircraft's rockets and bombs could obliterate the heavy tanks in moments. But the most decisive weapon was not a new gun or a new plane. It was the endless supply of men and machines pouring through French ports. For every Tiger that prowled the hedgerows, there were 50 Shermans rolling off landing ships, their crews young, untested, and unafraid. Statistics paint the chilling truth. In Normandy alone, the Allies landed nearly 7,000 tanks within weeks. Germany could muster fewer than 500 Tigers for the entire Western Front across the whole war. The scales of battle were no longer balanced. The myth of the Tiger had collided with the reality of the Sherman, an army of steel built not to impress but to overwhelm. On the battlefield, soldiers began to understand the grim equation. A Tiger might destroy 10 Shermans, but the 11th would get through, and in a war of attrition, that was all that mattered. Inside the cramped belly of a Sherman, fear was constant. The crew nicknamed their tank the Ronson after the cigarette lighter, because it lights up the first time, every time. With gasoline engines and thinner armor, a hit from a Tiger's 88mm cannon often meant instant immolation. Survivors told of comrades screaming as flames swallowed the interior, ammunition cooking off like fireworks. One American tanker recalled clawing his way out of the hatch, only to find his best friend trapped, burning alive inside the turret. He never forgot the sound. War was not about glory inside these steel beasts. It was about the suffocating weight of knowing that your machine was built to die before you were built to win. But the Sherman held secrets of its own. Unlike the Tiger, it was not a prison of engineering perfection. It was flexible, adaptable, alive with variance. Some Shermans mounted flamethrowers, earning the terrifying nickname Zippos. Others carried rocket launchers, bridge-laying gear, or amphibious kits to swim ashore during D-Day. The Sherman became not one tank but a family, an ecosystem of war machines. Allied planners embraced its versatility. A Sherman might not win in a duel against a Tiger, but in combined arms warfare, it was irreplaceable. In the hedgerows of Normandy, Sherman crews developed brutal improvisations. They welded iron spikes to the front, creating rhino tanks that could smash through thick bockage walls and ambush Tigers at close range. They painted deceptive markings, disguising Fireflies among regular Shermans so that German gunners could not easily pick them out. They learned to use numbers as a weapon. 3 Shermans circling 1 Tiger, sacrificing 2 if it meant the third got behind for a killing shot. It was a horrifying calculation, lives traded for survival, men reduced to arithmetic on the battlefield. Meanwhile, German crews faced their own nightmare. Every Tiger they lost was irreplaceable. They wrote bitterly in their diaries of breakdowns that stranded them, of fuel shortages that forced them to abandon their tanks, of Allied air power that hunted them like prey. The Tiger, once a symbol of unstoppable dominance, had become a coffin waiting for its turn. And yet, the myth persisted. To Allied infantrymen advancing on foot, the silhouette of a tiger in the tree line was enough to paralyze entire platoons. To tank crews climbing into Shermans, it was a shadow that haunted every mission. The duel between Tiger and Sherman was not just mechanical, it was psychological, a clash of myth versus math, terror versus inevitability. And slowly, inevitability began to win. By the winter of 1944, the Tiger had become a paradox. On paper, it was unmatched, thicker armor than anything the Allies could field, firepower that could turn any Sherman into scrap at ranges where return fire was useless. Yet on the battlefield, the Tiger was dying, not always from enemy shells, but from its own weight, its own hunger, its own complexity. German maintenance logs reveal a staggering truth. For every Tiger in combat, up to 3 more sat idle, broken down or waiting for spare parts. Crews spent more time with wrenches than with ammunition. In desperate moments, mechanics stripped parts from one Tiger to keep another alive, a process soldiers grimly nicknamed cannibalismus, cannibalism. For Sherman crews, there was no such dilemma. Their tanks were not built as masterpieces, but as workhorses. They could be repaired in the field with tools as simple as hammers and welding torches. Engines could be swapped in hours, tracks replaced overnight, entire tanks shipped by rail and road in a constant stream. When a Sherman burned, the men grieved. But by dawn, a new Sherman often waited, fueled, armed and ready. The psychological difference was enormous. German crews entered combat praying their tanks would survive long enough to retreat. Allied crews entered combat knowing that even in death, their sacrifice could be absorbed by the machine of industry. This imbalance reached its peak during the Ardennes offensive, the Battle of the Bulge. As snow blanketed the forests of Belgium, tigers and their heavier cousins, the king tigers, rolled into American lines. Their shells tore through Shermans in the frozen woods, sending fireballs into the night sky. For a brief moment, it seemed as though the Tiger might resurrect Germany's fading hope. Yet the offensive collapsed, not from lack of courage, but from lack of fuel. Tigers sat frozen in the snow, abandoned wits, where they ran dry. Shermans, lighter and more fuel-efficient, pressed on relentlessly, supplied by an endless chain of American logistics that reached back across the Atlantic Ocean. One captured German officer, when interrogated by the Americans, summed up the truth bitterly. "You have quantity, we have quality, but quality dies and quantity does not." His words cut deeper than propaganda ever could. The Tiger was a masterpiece, drowning in its own brilliance. The Sherman was flawed, but it was alive in numbers, alive in adaptability, alive in the cold arithmetic that decided the war. To the men who fought inside them, Shermans and Tigers were not statistics. They were cages of steel, soaked in sweat, fear, and the smell of oil. Diaries from tank crews reveal the human side of this armoured duel, stories rarely told in history books. A Sherman gunner named Joseph Scalzo wrote in his pocket diary during the push through France, "Every time I see a Tiger, my stomach twists. We fire, and the shells just bounce. It feels like throwing stones at a bear. But when there's 5 of us, and only 1 of him, we start to believe we can win. Sometimes that belief is all that keeps us going." Across the line, a German loader named Franz Staudinger described life inside a Tiger. "It is hot, dark, and loud. The walls shake with every shot. We feel powerful when the 88 fires. But I know the truth. We are too few. Each time I climb into the tank, I wonder if I will climb out again. The Russians and the Americans never stop coming. We kill and kill and kill, and still they come." The contrast is striking. For the Germans, every battle was an act of defiance, a desperate gamble against overwhelming odds. For the Allies, every battle was a step forward, 1 loss absorbed by 10 reinforcements, 1 burned-out Sherman replaced by another rolling off a ship. The war ground forward, not as a clash of equals, but as a slow suffocation. And yet, soldiers on both sides shared something terrible in common. the intimacy of death inside steel coffins. Survivors tell of the deafening clang of shells ricocheting, of molten metal spalling off the walls, of comrades torn apart in an instant. Tank warfare was not about distance, it was about sudden, brutal endings. One Sherman commander recalled seeing the turret of his friend's tank blown clean off by a Tiger shot, the crew inside vaporized. A German tanker remembered a rocket from a P-47 striking near his Tiger, the below, just flipping the massive machine onto its side, crushing men trapped within. To historians, the duel between Tiger and Sherman is about numbers, production, and strategy. But to the men inside, it was about survival, about praying through the smoke and fire, about wondering if the next shell was meant for them. In that sense, both crews were prisoners, victims of machines larger than themselves, fighting wars decided far away in factories and war rooms. In the summer of 1944, as Allied forces poured through Normandy, the Tiger was still feared, but the battlefield had changed. The skies no longer belonged to Germany. Above every hedgerow, above every village, Allied aircraft roared, thousands of fighters and bombers hunting for targets. For a Tiger crew, the real terror was no longer just the Sherman. It was the shriek of a P-47 Thunderbolt diving from the clouds, or the whistle of rockets unleashed by a Typhoon fighter bomber. Survivors described the sound as something inhuman, a banshee scream that froze blood before the explosions even landed. One German tanker recalled, "We never felt safe, not even when hidden in the woods. At any moment the sky could open and fire would rain down. The Tiger was strong, but against the air it was nothing. We were trapped animals, waiting for the hunter above to choose us." The Allies had discovered the ultimate counter to the Tiger. Not another tank, but total dominance of the air. Shermans advanced not alone, but beneath a shield of fighters and bombers, their movements choreographed with artillery and infantry. The Tiger was left to fight not just the enemy in front, but the enemy above. And yet, the Tiger's legend refused to die. Even as they abandoned wrecks smouldering in the bocage, German propaganda painted the Tiger as invincible. Newspapers exaggerated kill counts, turning tank aces into national heroes. To the German people, Wittmann and his Tigers were proof that victory was still possible. But inside the Reich, Hitler's generals knew the truth. Reports sent to Berlin in late 1944 warned that losses could no longer be replaced. Production was slowing, fuel was vanishing, and crews were dwindling. The Tiger had become a weapon of myth, fighting in fewer and fewer numbers, its shadow larger than its reality. Meanwhile, American factories accelerated. By autumn 1944, the US was producing nearly 2,000 Shermans every month. Ship convoys stretched across the Atlantic, delivering an endless tide of armor, fuel, ammunition, and men. For every Tiger destroyed in the field, dozens of Shermans arrived to replace the fallen. It was a cycle Germany could not match. The Reich was bleeding tanks faster than it could build them, while the Allies drowned Europe in steel. By the time the Allies pushed toward the German border, the duel had become symbolic. The Tiger represented perfection, but perfection in too few numbers. The Sherman represented imperfection, but imperfection multiplied to infinity. And in war, infinity always wins. By late 1944, as Allied forces crossed into Germany, the Tiger's shadow loomed larger than the machine itself. Soldiers on both sides knew its roar, but increasingly it was only a roar from memory. Most Tigers never even reached the battlefield. They broke down on the way, consumed fuel faster than convoys could supply, or were left abandoned in the mud, engines seized, their crews ordered to destroy them with explosives before retreating. For every Tiger that fired its gun, another was left smouldering without firing a shot. Yet when a Tiger did appear, the effect was immediate and devastating. One Sherman crew advancing near Aachen described the moment they spotted the hulking silhouette through the smoke. It was like seeing death itself. "We knew our shells couldn't touch it from the front. We fired anyway, more to distract than to kill. Then the 88 spoke and our world went white." The Tiger's gun tore through Shermans with surgical precision, its shells passing through one tank and into another. Crews who survived spoke of the terror of watching their friends' machines explode into fireballs within seconds. The myth of invincibility was dead, but the fear lived on. To counter this, Allied tactics became colder, more calculated. Shermans did not face Tigers one-on-one unless they had no choice. Instead, commanders coordinated assaults in packs, using speed, maneuver, and overwhelming fire. Infantry with bazookas swarmed from hedgerows, artillery blanketed Tiger positions before tank duels could even begin, and fighter bombers prowled above. The Tiger was forced into hiding, reduced to ambushes rather than open battles. For every Tiger crew that fought like lions, there were 10 Shermans closing in from every direction, with air support waiting to finish what the tanks could not. And still, German propaganda clung to the Tiger. Radio broadcasts told of single-teeth Gers destroying entire columns, of crews who stood like gods against waves of Shermans. Some stories were true. Recorded kill counts prove that Tigers could and did slaughter dozens in an engagement. But the greater truth was that these victories no longer mattered. A destroyed column of Shermans was replaced by another within days. A destroyed Tiger was a hole that Germany could never fill. The war was shifting from duels of steel to the suffocating reality of exhaustion. And for the men inside these machines, whether Sherman or Tiger, the battlefield was no longer about glory. It was about survival, in a war where survival itself was becoming impossible. December 1944. The Ardennes. Snow lay heavy over the forests of Belgium as Germany launched its last great gamble, the Battle of the Bulge. Out of the mist rolled the Tiger II, the so-called King Tiger, even heavier and deadlier than its predecessor. Its armor was nearly impregnable. Its long-barreled .88 could rip open a Sherman from over 2 kilometers away. To American tank crews caught in the frozen woods, it felt like the nightmare had returned, bigger and darker than before. Sherman commanders wrote of hearing the thunderous crack of the Tiger II's gun echoing across the trees, followed by the fireball of a tank vanishing in snow and flame. Whole platoons were pinned down by a single German giant. One American tanker described the first time he saw the King Tiger. It looked like a fortress rolling out of the fog. We fired at it until our barrels smoked, but the shells just bounced. We knew right then that we weren't fighting a tank. We were fighting time. But time was the one thing Germany no longer had. The King Tiger was a marvel of engineering, but it was a curse to its own army. Weighing 70 tons, it guzzled fuel that no convoy could spare. Its massive engine strained under the cold, and its transmissions shattered under pressure. Dozens were lost not to enemy fire, but to breakdowns and empty fuel tanks. Crews abandoned them in the snow, sometimes blowing them up, other times leaving them as trophies for advancing Americans. The battlefield was littered with these mechanical monuments, symbols of brilliance that Germany could no longer afford. Meanwhile, the Shermans adapted once more. Engineers had rushed new models to the front, the M4A3E8 Easy 8, fitted with a high-velocity 76mm gun, faster, more reliable, and better armoured. Fireflies hunted alongside them, their long barrels ready to punch through even a King Tiger from the flank. Above, swarms of Allied aircraft turned every road into a death trap. German tankers wrote bitterly of feeling hunted not by men, but by machines that never tired, never stopped. The Ardennes offensive collapsed, and with it the last illusion of German strength. The King Tiger had arrived too late, too heavy, too few. The Sherman, once mocked as undergunned and fragile, was now everywhere. Thousands of them pushing into Germany, each one proof that the war had shifted from the brilliance of design to the inevitability of mass. The myth of the Tiger still lingered. But now, even its crews began to understand. The age of the giant was over. The age of the swarm had begun. By early 1945, the Tiger had become a relic of its own legend. The Reich was collapsing, cities reduced to rubble, and German industry strangled by bombing raids and fuel shortages. In Berlin, Hitler still demanded reports of Tiger victories, clinging to the belief that a handful of these armoured giants could turn the tide. But in reality, fewer than 200 Tigers remained across the entire front, scattered, outnumbered, and constantly hunted. For every Tiger still fighting, hundreds of Shermans pressed forward, rolling through Belgium, crossing the Rhine, cutting through Germany's heartland. American soldiers advancing into towns often found Tigers not in battle, but abandoned in barns, factories, or village squares. Their crews had fled or destroyed them with explosives before capture. The Allies examined these wrecks closely, engineers marvelling at the craftsmanship, the thick armour, the precision-machined gears. But they also saw the fatal flaw. Each Tiger took thousands of hours to build, and Germany no longer had thousands of hours. Across the ocean, American factories built a Sherman in just over a week. The war was not just being fought on the battlefield, it was being fought on assembly lines, and Germany had already lost. Yet for the men in Shermans, the fear never truly left. Even in the war's final months, stories circulated of single Tigers holding crossroads, destroying dozens of American tanks before finally being overwhelmed. One such battle near Kassel in April 1945 saw a lone Tiger II ambush an American column, knocking out 14 Shermans in minutes. Only when artillery and airstrikes were called in did the monster fall silent. Survivors wrote that the wreck still smoked for hours, as if unwilling to admit defeat. Inside these duels, the human cost was unbearable. Sherman crews rotated so quickly that many never survived long enough to leer, and the weaknesses of the Tiger. German crews, seasoned but exhausted, fought with the fatal knowledge that each loss was final, that their deaths could not be replaced. Both sides lived inside machines designed by men far away, engineers, politicians, dictators, who never smelled the burning flesh inside a hit tank, never felt the steel walls vibrate with incoming fire. In the end, the Tiger was undone not by Sherman guns, but by arithmetic. A weapon built to dominate in single combat was dragged down by the weight of thousands of enemies. And as the Allies crossed deeper into Germany, even the most hardened Tiger crewmen had to face the truth. They were no longer the hunters. They were the hunted, and the war was closing in on them. Spring, 1945. The Reich was burning. Columns of Shermans rolled across the German countryside, their stars painted white against a sea of mud and smoke. Civilians watched them pass, silent, broken, clutching children in bombed-out ruins. The Tiger, once the terrifying emblem of German might, was now more ghost than weapon. Crews who had once carried themselves like armoured knights now fought with desperation, rationing shells, conserving fuel, praying for the chance to even fire before being buried under an avalanche of steel and firepower. The last duels were fought not on open fields, but in shattered cities. Streets clogged with rubble became death traps, where Shermans advanced cautiously, their guns sweeping windows and doorways. Here, a Tiger could still be king. From a concealed position, one ambush could destroy multiple Allied tanks before they even knew what hit them. But the price was finality. Once spotted, a Tiger became the centre of the battlefield, a magnet for artillery, rockets, and swarming infantry. Survivors recalled how entire neighbourhoods were reduced to rubble just to eliminate a single tank. In Berlin, Hitler's orders demanded that Tigers defend the city to the last shell. The reality was far grimmer. Many of the crews were boys, 16, 17 years old, barely trained, shoved into machines they could hardly operate. Veterans called them children in coffins, for the Tiger was no longer a sword, but a tomb. Even so, these young gunners, filled with indoctrinated zeal or sheer fear, sometimes managed the impossible, knocking out advancing Shermans, buying hours or even a day of resistance. Yet every victory was hollow, swallowed by the inevitability of collapse. For the Sherman crews, the advance into Germany was a mixture of grim determination and quiet dread. They had won the numbers war, but at a terrible cost. Every burned-out Sherman along the roadside told the same story, that victory was not free, and that no matter how outnumbered, the tiger could still kill. Some crews wrote in their diaries that they felt more pity than fear in those final battles. Pity for the boys in German tanks who never had a chance. Pity for the wasted brilliance of a machine too perfect, too costly, too late. As the Red Army closed from the east and the Allies from the west, the tiger's story reached its bitter end. No longer a terror that shook armies, it became a relic scattered in ruins, a monument to a war machine whose shadow outlived its substance. The battlefield had moved on, but the legend was only beginning to take root. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, Europe was a graveyard of steel. Fields, forests, and city streets were littered with the hulks of tanks, Shermans burned black, Panthers rusting in ditches, and here and there the carcass of a tiger. Soldiers from both sides gathered around the wrecks, some in awe, others in bitter relief. For Allied tankers, standing before a destroyed tiger was proof that the monster could be killed. For Germans, seeing its twisted remains was a reminder that even their greatest weapon could not save them from defeat. Yet the tiger's story did not die on the battlefield. It lived on in whispers, in memoirs, in the haunted recollections of those who faced it. Allied tank crews, even in victory, spoke of the tiger with a mixture of fear and respect. One Sherman commander later admitted, "We won the war, but the moment we saw a tiger, every man in the crew knew it might be his last day." The psychological power of the tiger endured long after its physical threat had vanished. The world's militaries studied the wrecks. Engineers measured the armor, dissected the gun, examined the precision craftsmanship. Some marveled at its design, calling it the pinnacle of tank warfare. Others shook their heads, noting the absurd costs, the fragility of its parts, the impossibility of mass production. In the end, the tiger was both a technological marvel and a strategic blunder. It was the sharpest sword Germany ever forged, but one swung far too late, and against an enemy who fought not with elegance, but with overwhelming, grinding force. Meanwhile, the Sherman rolled on into history, not as the most powerful, but as the most enduring. Over 49,000 built, serving in every theatre of the war, and continuing to fight in conflicts long after Germany had fallen. Where the tiger became a legend of destruction, the Sherman became the symbol of victory, of that reliability, numbers and adaptability could triumph over brilliance alone. Still, among veterans and historians alike, the debates began. Was the tiger the greatest tank of the war, or the most overrated? Was it a terror that shaped the battlefield, or a myth inflated by fear and propaganda? The answer, perhaps, lay not in the wrecks of steel, but in the memories of the men who fought inside them. Men who carried the weight of decisions made far above their heads, decisions that turned machines into legends, and legends into ghosts that still haunt the story of World War II. As the war's ashes settled, the tiger became something more than a weapon. It became a myth. Stories spread faster than facts. In Allied barracks and veterans' reunions, tales of the tiger grew darker, almost supernatural. Tank crews spoke of its armor as impenetrable, its gun as a death sentence the moment it fired. Some swore that a single tiger could destroy an entire company of Shermans, disappearing afterward like a phantom. Others whispered that the only way to kill one was sheer luck, a shot from the flank, or a bomb dropped by fate itself. In truth, the reality was far more complicated. Yes, there were days when a tiger ruled the battlefield. Records confirm engagements where lone tigers destroyed dozens of enemy tanks in a single fight. But just as often they broke down before reaching combat, their crews forced to abandon them in frustration. For every battle where the tiger seemed invincible, there were dozens where it never even fired a shot. But myths are rarely built on balance. They are built on fear, and the tiger had mastered fear. Meanwhile, the Sherman's story took a different shape. Veterans did not speak of it as a monster, but as a companion, a workhorse, a machine that carried them through hell. They cursed its thin armor and weak gun, but they also praised its speed, its reliability, its ability to take punishment and keep moving. The Sherman was not a legend in the same sense, it was a survivor. And for many men, survival meant more than glory. Historians later wrestled with the contrast. The Tiger was a technological masterpiece, but it consumed Germany's dwindling resources, each one a fortress that came too few and too late. The Sherman, mass-produced in staggering numbers, was never meant to be perfect. It was meant to win. When the two met, the outcome was already written in the factories, in the fuel reserves, in the sheer scale of the WWII. But numbers and logistics cannot erase the memories. For every veteran who stared into the smoke-filled sky, waiting for the Tiger's gun to find them, the legend was more real than any statistic. The Sherman won the war, but the Tiger haunted the minds of those who fought it. And that haunting, more than steel or strategy, ensured that the Tiger's shadow would never truly fade. After the war, the Tiger lived a second life, not on the battlefield, but in memory, rumor, and reconstruction. Allied soldiers carried home stories of duels with the beast, and soon the Tiger became a legend that outgrew reality. In taverns, memoirs, and whispered tales, the numbers multiplied. A single Tiger was said to have destroyed 50 Shermans in one clash, or to have held entire divisions at bay. The truth was stretched into something closer to folklore than fact. Hollywood and war novels soon seized on the myth. In films, the Tiger appeared as an unstoppable force, looming from the smoke like a mechanical dragon. To audiences, it seemed like the ultimate war machine, proof of German engineering genius. Few cared to remember that most Tigers spent more time in repair yards than in combat, or that many were abandoned without firing. Reality was messy, myth was clean, and the myth was irresistible. The Sherman, by contrast, earned less glamour. On screen and in books, it was rarely shown as heroic. It was the underdog, the disposable machine that men climbed into, knowing it might not bring them home. Veterans who fought inside it remembered the sting of being called death traps, of hearing the nickname Ronson whispered because they lit up the first time. But those same men also remembered the Sherman's gift. It was always there. When one burned, another rolled forward. It never left the battlefield empty. Museums collected the remains. Today, Tigers sit in silence, fewer than 10 still intact across the world. Visitors stand in awe of their size, their brutal lines, the thickness of their armor. They lean close, peering at the scars where shells had struck and failed to penetrate. Children stare as if they are looking at monsters from another age. Yet beside them, rows of Shermans tell a quieter story, not of terror, but of endurance, of sheer will made eye. To steal, the Tiger had won glory, but lost the war. The Sherman had won no glory, but carried its army to victory. The contrast was stark, almost poetic. In the clash of these two machines, the lesson was not about which was stronger, but about what kind of strength truly decides wars. Brilliance dazzles, but persistence breaks empires. In the decades that followed, the Tiger became a ghost that lingered in military thought. Cold War generals studied its design, its firepower, its ability to instill terror. They asked themselves, what if Germany had built more? What if the Tiger had rolled off assembly lines in the thousands instead of hundreds? Could the war have taken a darker turn? These questions fueled debates, documentaries, and countless books, each weighing the Tiger's legend against its reality. The truth was paradoxical. The Tiger was never meant to be built in numbers. It was conceived as a breakthrough weapon, a fearsome answer to Soviet armor, a machine designed for dominance in singular encounters. In that role, it excelled, able to outgun and outlast anything placed before it. But war is not a duel. War is attrition, logistics, and time. And in those arenas, the Tiger was doomed before it ever fired its first shell. The Sherman, by contrast, was forgotten in many circles, too ordinary, too widespread, too familiar. Yet it shaped the post-war world far more deeply than the Tiger ever could. While Tigers rusted in ruins, Shermans rolled on into Korea, into the Middle East, into dozens of smaller wars where its reliability and numbers once again proved decisive. Nations that could not afford brilliance chose survival, and the Sherman delivered. Its legacy was not terror but utility, the kind of legacy that shapes history quietly, without fanfare. Still, the Tiger's shadow stretched far. For tank crews of later generations, the name carried weight. To face a Tiger became shorthand for facing the impossible, for standing against odds so overwhelming that survival itself became an act of defiance. In this way, the Tiger achieved what its designers never could: immortality. It became a symbol not just of German engineering, but of fear itself, a reminder that sometimes the legend of a weapon outlasts the war it was built for. For the men who fought inside these machines, the legends felt hollow. Survivors carried memories of friends burned alive, of machines struck and torn apart, of duels fought in seconds that determined life or death. They knew that neither Tiger nor Sherman was a myth. They were cages of steel, each with its own kind of mercy and cruelty. And as veterans aged and their stories faded, one truth remained: wars are not won by legends, but by the men who endure them. By the twilight of the war, and in the decades that followed, the Tiger versus Sherman story became more than just a clash of machines. It became a mirror of two different philosophies of war. On one side stood the Tiger, a weapon born of perfectionism, an obsession with superiority at any cost. On the other stood the Sherman, a machine of pragmatism, built not for duels of glory, but for the relentless grind of a global conflict. The battlefield proved which vision would endure. German engineers had dreamed of machines that could dominate any opponent. The Tiger embodied that dream, its armor, its gun, its sheer presence unmatched. But every mile it drove, every shot it fired, demanded resources Germany could not spare. Crews sometimes joked bitterly that they were less tankers and more mechanics, forever fixing engines, changing tracks, begging for fuel that never came. The Tiger was built for victories Germany could no longer afford. The Sherman, by contrast, represented something colder but truer. It was never the strongest tank, never the deadliest, but it was always there. Crews could rely on it to start in the morning, to drive through mud and snow, to fight again tomorrow. Factories could produce them by the thousands, and supply chains could keep them fed with parts and fuel. If a Sherman burned, another took its place within days. That was the grim calculus of war. Machines could be lost, but time could not. And yet myths outlast mathematics. Veterans passed down their stories, and in their memories the Tiger loomed like a monster of steel, while the Sherman remained the underdog that somehow survived. Films, novels, and later video games resurrected the duels, fueling imaginations with visions of unstoppable Tigers tearing through waves of Shermans. But the reality was more tragic than glorious. Every burned-out tank, whether German or American, carried WWII, with it the same smell of smoke, the same silence of men who would never climb out of the hatch again. In the end, the Tiger's legend was not about numbers or victories. It was about fear, the raw human terror of facing something you believed could not be stopped. The Sherman's legacy, quieter but more enduring, was not about fear but about persistence. And in the ruins of Europe, persistence, not brilliance, proved to be the weapon that ended the war. As the Cold War dawned, the Tiger's shadow lingered not only in memory but in doctrine. NATO officers and Soviet planners alike studied its lines, its thick plates, its monstrous gun. They measured its wrecks, tested captured survivors, and asked themselves, what if a future enemy fields something like this? The Tiger had lost its war, but it had already begun shaping the next. For Germany, the Tiger was a bittersweet inheritance. Its surviving engineers, many absorbed into post-war industries or even recruited by the Allies, admitted that the tank was both a marvel and a disaster. They spoke of its precision tolerances, how its parts were milled to perfection, but how that very perfection made it fragile in mud, snow, and chaos. They admitted that it was a weapon designed for short wars and lightning victories, not for the grinding years that Hitler's war demanded. And yet they also remembered its power, the way enemy tanks fled at the mere sight of its silhouette, the way a single shot could change the course of a battle. The Sherman's path after 1945 was far less glamorous, but far more practical. While Tigers were hauled away as museum pieces, Shermans rolled into Korea, fought in Israel, burned in the deserts of Sinai, and even clashed against Soviet-built armor in wars long after their German rivals were nothing but rust. To soldiers in these later conflicts, the Sherman was not a legend but a tool, sometimes outdated, sometimes underpowered, but always there, always fighting. Its story never needed myth, because it had history carved into the soil of half the world. And yet, in the popular imagination, the Tiger always overshadowed the Sherman. It was remembered not as the failed gamble it truly was, but as the monster that stalked battlefields, the nightmare that Allied tankers whispered about before sleep. Video reels from captured German propaganda showed lines of Tigers rumbling forward, invincible and menacing, and the world remembered the image, not the truth. Even decades later, the myth still held. But for the men who had been inside these machines, both Tiger and Sherman, the myth was hollow. Survivors rarely spoke of glory. They spoke of fire, of screams, of seconds that stretched into lifetimes as shells struck home. They spoke of friends who never made it out of the turret. And in their silence, more powerful than any statistic, lay the truth. Tanks did not win wars. Men did, and men paid the price. The war was over, but the ghosts of the Tiger and Sherman lingered in the minds of those who had lived through them. Veterans carried the weight differently. German crewmen, once proud of serving in the most feared machine of the war, often spoke in tones of bitterness. They had fought like lions, but they knew in their hearts it was for nothing. The Tiger had made them feel invincible for minutes, but helpless for months, forever short on fuel, forever broken down, forever outnumbered. One veteran later admitted, "We were kings for 1 hour, then corpses for the rest of the war." On the Allied side, Sherman crews had a different burden. They had survived inside machines they often cursed. Diaries told of the dread of climbing into a Ronson, knowing that one hit might turn the tank into a furnace. And yet those same diaries spoke of gratitude, that the Sherman kept moving, that reinforcements always came, that somehow, despite the odds, enough of them lived to see the end. For many, the Sherman became less a symbol of war and more a symbol of survival. But survival did not erase the trauma. Families noticed how veterans would wake screaming at night, how they flinched at loud noises, how they never spoke of the war except in fragments. To them, the Tiger was not a legend. It was the echo of shells, the shadow of death looming across the battlefield. To the Germans, it was both pride and curse. To the Americans, it was both terror and testament. To both, it was unforgettable. Historians later framed the duel as a clash of philosophies, quality versus quantity, perfection versus pragmatism. But the veterans knew it was simpler and crueler. Wars are not won by the best machine, but by the machine that is there when it's needed most. The Tiger could dominate the battlefield, but the Sherman could fill it. The Tiger could inspire fear, but the Sherman could end wars. And so, even as rust consumed the last wrecks and museums polished the survivors into exhibits, the real battle continued, in memory, in myth, in the unhealed wounds of those who had fought. The Tiger and the Sherman were no longer machines of steel. They were machines of memory, and memory can be heavier than any armor ever forged. By the late 20th century, the Tiger had transformed fully into a myth of war. Veterans aged and passed away, but their stories, filtered through memory, fear, and the hunger of younger generations to hear about the monster tank, turned the Tiger into something larger than history. Wargamers, novelists, filmmakers, and later video game designers resurrected it again and again, until the tiger lived not just in museums but in imaginations across the world. In popular culture, the tiger was always larger than life. It was the villain on screen, the dragon that heroes had to slay, the unstoppable wall of steel thundering toward fragile Shermans. And yet that very mythology betrayed the truth. The tiger had been rare, crippled by logistics, and often abandoned. The Sherman had been everywhere, rolling across deserts, through villages, over rivers, until it had covered the globe. But myths thrive on terror, not statistics. The Sherman was history. The tiger was legend. Meanwhile, military thinkers never dismissed the tiger entirely. It served as a cautionary tale, proof that brilliance without balance could drain an army dry. NATO planners pointed to its fate when warning against over-engineering future weapons. Soviet designers who had once feared the Tiger's 88 focused on mass production of simpler, rugged designs like the T-55. The lesson was clear. In modern war, survival belongs not to the sharpest blade, but to the blade that never breaks. Still, the Tiger's aura persisted. Tourists flocked to see the few surviving machines, standing silent in Bovington, in Moscow, in France. Children stare wide-eyed, imagining the power it once held, while veterans who fought against it sometimes fall silent, remembering friends lost to its fire. The tiger endures not because of what it was, but because of what it symbolized: fear, power, inevitability. And the Sherman? It stands, too, though more quietly. In memorial parks across the world, Shermans are mounted on stone pedestals, painted and polished, reminders not of terror, but of triumph. They tell a different story, that wars are not won by myths, but by men willing to climb into imperfect machines day after day, until the impossible becomes inevitable. The tiger roared, the Sherman endured, and in the end, endurance outlived the roar. Even now, nearly a century later, the duel of tiger and Sherman still ignites arguments among historians, veterans' families, and enthusiasts. Was the tiger truly the greatest tank of World War II? Or was it a colossal mistake, a monument to wasted resources? Was the Sherman an underpowered death trap, or the single most important armoured vehicle of the Allied victory? The truth lies tangled between myth and memory, statistics and scars. For the tiger, greatness was never in numbers. It was in presence. A single tiger could command the battlefield, its silhouette enough to make enemy tankers question whether to advance or retreat. Fear is a weapon, and in that role the tiger was unmatched. But fear cannot win wars alone. In the end, it was overwhelmed not by enemy fire, but by logistics, fuel shortages, and the grinding inevitability of numbers. For the Sherman, weakness was never in firepower. It was in perception. Crews cursed it, mocked it, feared climbing into it. And yet, when the war ended, the Sherman stood as the most successful tank of its era. It did not need to be perfect. It needed to be available, reliable, adaptable. It carried more men to victory than any other machine of the war. Where the tiger was remembered for its few moments of terror, the Sherman was remembered for its endless days of survival. The legend of the tiger endures because it speaks to something primal, the fear of facing an enemy stronger than yourself. The legacy of the Sherman endures because it speaks to something human, the will to keep moving forward despite that fear. Together, they tell a story larger than either machine. The story of how wars are decided not by perfection, but by persistence. And for the men who fought, that truth carried the heaviest weight. They knew that inside the steel, legends did not matter. Tigers burned, Shermans burned, and the men inside paid the price. Long after the machines were gone, the veterans carried the memories, smoke in the lungs, ringing in the ears, faces that never came home. The world remembers the machines, the men remembered the cost. In the final measure, the clash of Tiger and Sherman was never truly about steel, it was about men. Men who climbed into cramped turrets, hands trembling on triggers, eyes straining through periscopes clouded with mud and smoke. Men who carried photographs of families in their breast pockets, who whispered prayers as engines roared, who knew that a single second might decide life or death. The tiger gave those men power, the illusion of invincibility, the feeling of riding inside a fortress. But it also gave them isolation. Outnumbered, outpaced, trapped in machines too rare to be replaced, tiger crews fought battles they could not win. They became symbols of defiance, but also of futility, their victories swallowed whole by the unstoppable tide of Allied strength. The Sherman gave its crews no illusions. They knew their armor was thin, their gun often outmatched, their survival never guaranteed. And yet the Sherman gave them something the tiger could not: endurance. It was always there, another waiting behind, another column rolling forward. For every Sherman that burned, the war machine of democracy sent 10 more to take its place. That endurance, multiplied by thousands, broke the Reich. And so the tiger roared and fell silent. The Sherman rattled on, not glamorous, not perfect, but unstoppable. One became a myth, the other became history. One inspired fear, the other delivered victory. Together they wrote one of the most haunting chapters of World War II, where engineering genius collided with industrial might, and where legends were forged not in glory, but in fire and loss. Today, both stand silent in museums and memorials. Children run their hands along cold steel, unaware of the screams once trapped inside. Tourists snap photographs beside them, never hearing the pounding of hearts that once echoed within those armored walls. But if you listen closely, closer than the silence, you can almost hear it. The grind of tracks, the crack of the 88, the desperate rattle of a Sherman's gun. You can almost feel the weight of men who knew they were part of something larger, something cruel, something eternal. The tiger was fear. The Sherman was persistence. And history remembers both, not as machines of war, but as reminders, that legends burn bright and fade, but endurance changes the world.